is going to be an important aspect for anyone who is a diabetic, anyone who is possibly pre-diabetic, and this is about what's happened to me in my 16 years of dealing with the disease. Now, during this time, I've dealt with a lot of doctors, nutritionists, etc. And what I'm going to talk about, and what Adele Davis talked about, was about as frank as you can get about what can happen to you if you do not control the glucose levels in your blood. Sometimes it's called sugars. Technically, it's glucose. What's sad to me is that if the doctors had prepared more people about this, the conditions would be far less. But there's a feeling, and this is only a supposition on my part, a feeling that if the doctor says too much about these things, then possibly you may not want to come back to see him. That's always a possibility in reducing their business. Now, it is difficult to deal with the situation. And I'm here to at least explore some of the things that have happened to me and to hopefully give you more knowledge about the critical aspects of diabetes. I am not a doctor, but I am one who's experienced the walk. The walk changes for many different people. But what I'm going to talk about is relatively similar to for many people. This strange screen that you see this evening is not the screen that was planned. I am a type 2 diabetic. That is the title of the program. The reason is that my first-line engineer who prepares my slides could not find him. Then I had a backup who could not prepare the slides soon enough. Never forget, this is an amateur production, and I agree wholeheartedly. There is a difference that everything I say is documented, and I have the backup for what I say, and it's very important that it is that way. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Adele Davis, she was a very interesting person, and I want to discuss some of the things she's just said. I could not say it any better, and that's why I read it from her book. Personally, to know I am degreed in a couple of different fields. One is chemistry and one is engineering, metallurgical engineering. And to me, what I've done is I've just utilized the kind of work I do in my daily life, and I've become the experiment. I'm very disciplined, and it's very important to be disciplined. And it is a disease that is an enemy every minute of your day, every day of the year. It's unrelenting. And the consequences, unless controlled, leads to a lot of sadness. It's a very slow death. And it's something that I would not wish on my worst enemies. I have been waiting a long time. I have my favorite notebook here with different people I've tried to encourage to come. Last 2 weeks ago, I had a program where Mrs. X, she didn't identify herself, she responded to the program that I had was Women in Submarines and Don't Ask, Don't Tell. She had good questions, and we had a little discussion about 10 minutes, and I gave her my phone number, hoping that she'd come in and have a discussion, but as what's happened in the past, there's a willingness, but when it comes down to actually act on it, it doesn't happen. Mrs. X goes along with Mr. X, and I had Cardinal Sean O'Malley. I invited him, Mr. X, and I got the Unitarian viewpoint. So I invite many different people, and we're here to have conversations. And so Mrs. X complained the fact that there wasn't anybody here. So then I explained what I've done, and I think she believes a little bit more about what's happened. I have a set of twin grandchildren at 13 years of age who would like to come to my program, but my daughter, their mother, won't let them. But there'll be a time during the next few years when they're very rebellious. They love my program, they like to talk about it, but it's something that my daughter is kind of shy and she doesn't like to get involved. But the rebellious years are coming, Andrea, and they'll probably be willing to come on and hopefully you'll allow them, because certainly they are interested in doing something like this. I know there are hundreds of feminists in this town. There is some radical and then some liberal feminists. I would think that at some point in time that you'd like to come in and converse. I'm a conservative. I've been that way only for the last 20 years. Prior to that, I was a liberal Democrat. So hopefully at some point in time you will join in the conversation. Any subject you want would be great. Now this evening's program, as I said, I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to give medical advice. You consult with your doctor about that. I'm going to give you suggestions and also discuss what my walk with diabetes. Now I'd like to talk about this condition and make suggestions, and hopefully you'll gain something from it. This is the second in my series of my health series. The first program I had was prostate cancer. In Davis's book, the operative word here is that her actions, I guess, or her experience was with those people in the diabetic wards, and she experienced a number of different conditions. I remember when I was younger, about 20 years ago, I actually delivered high purity water to a kidney dialysis center, and it really changes a whole life. When you get the kidney disease, it's almost like living death in a sense. It was very sad, and the impressions of people's faces, it weren't smiles or anything else. It was very depressing to go there, and that has been really scribed in my mind. And ever since that time, the thing I have made the most important effort to is to make sure I don't end up in the same direction. So far, I have not. So what happened to me? I was never overweight. I was the way I am right now since I was my teens. I developed a disease just all of a sudden in my early 50s. Then I started thinking about my father. Similarly, he had it about the same age. Then I thought about my aunt, who I don't know as much about, but she had diabetes. What Davis is talking about can happen to anyone. It's really a dire set of circumstances. Amputation, I've known people blind, amputation, heart disease. It is an insidious disease is the best way to say it. It just takes you apart. If you get a heart attack, that's fine, it's over with. But this is not the same kind of disease. It is really depressing, but if you do follow the rules, at least you can live 16 years longer than you are right now, because I have made it that far and I'm still in excellent shape. In fact, if I don't, then I won't be able to have the show and I won't be able to say what I want to say, invite all of my liberal friends. Now, the onset was in early 1990s for me, and I was being treated by Dr. Kerrigan. At that time, Dr. Kerrigan was I guess a primary physician you'd call it, but he had a specialty in heart disease. He would take my blood and test it, and then one time I was developing some numbness in my feet several months after I had the test, which indicated I was all right. So every year, because he knew my history, that I did have diabetes in the family. So I was taking a test, and I didn't have any negative results from the test, but several months later, I developed some numbness in my feet. And it was actually going up my leg. And so I decided, I obviously, as soon as that happened, I went to him, and he said, you know, I don't know what the story is. Because we had a test taken of you, and the blood test indicated there was no diabetes. So he suggests I go to Dr. Shervin in Woburn. He's probably not practicing anymore. And he began a number of different tests. This, that, MRIs for about 5 or 6 months. And at the end of that, he couldn't find anything. So I was a man of few words at that time. No longer. In any case, I left there stunned, and I didn't even bother asking him well, you know, I have still numb feet and the condition's still there. So he obviously couldn't do anything more. I went to another neurologist, and within 3 weeks he found out I had diabetes. I had an unusual case of diabetes in the sense that I exercised extensively and I wasn't overweight, as I mentioned to you. So the condition I had is typically a condition you get after about 15, 16 years or 10 years of having the disease. So here's a reversal of the conditions that I had. Most people have frequent need for water, thirsty condition, and also frequent urination. Never had those circumstances whatsoever. My son-in-law's family has 2 incidents of diabetes in the family. So let's look at the diagnosis. What you eat and what you've eaten and the testing that I do using the meter is going to be your new way of life. It is a very great change. The things you like to eat, especially carbohydrates, are not really good for a diabetic. It actually accelerates the conditions that Adele Davis had mentioned in Let's Eat Well. I initially started just controlling my carbohydrates, which is rice, pasta, and for Italian to reduce his pasta intake is really quite a sacrifice alone. Desserts, so anything which has high carbohydrates, those elements, rice, I mentioned that, so all of those had to be reduced in moderation. So I was able to control my glucose levels in my blood reasonably well. But what is another insidious part of this disease is that regardless what you do and how well you do it, it's going to get worse. But that doesn't mean you give up, because if you give up, it is far worse. Amputation, heart disease, all these things, strokes, all can come frequently. And really, when you have all these conditions, they'll keep you alive, but it's not really the kind of life you want to lead. So do everything possible to reduce that chance. Eventually, what happened was that I had to go on a drug. It's a pancreas-stimulating drug. It stimulates the pancreas, the islets, to produce more insulin. The drugs are effective, but only up to a certain point. And eventually what happens is you'll go onto insulin, which I'm not right now. The insulin just helps to get the glucose into the cell. Without the insulin, the cells cannot utilize the glucose that's in the blood. It's very important. There's also another condition called Syndrome X, which is a combination of the fact that it's not just simply the amount of insulin that your pancreas produces, but also how it gets in. It's like a key to a lock. If the insulin isn't right or the cell isn't right, there's some other kinds of problems, the insulin cannot be utilized by the cell so that the glucose can be used as energy. So how do you control glucose that's in your blood? Well, there are 3 methods. One is, I mentioned, is diet. If you eat the right kinds of food, low carbohydrates, just like the Atkins diet, is very effective and is really the only dietary issue you can really use effectively. The second is to lose weight. If you have a substantial amount of weight, then you could probably get to a point of being really almost normal. If you're not that much overweight, in the case of me, it didn't help me. I had no problem with weight. I was always thin in my life. Then you really have to move on to the next step. Drugs. There are a number of drugs, and your doctor can prescribe them to you. So you have both diet and you have drugs. So halfway through the program, and I'd just like to review, this program is called I Am a Diabetic. I am a type 2 diabetic, and this is my story, just like the prostate cancer issue was. It was my story with somebody else. We're talking about the kinds of things you can do, the kinds of things you got to watch out for, there are factors of obesity, and that's one of the driving factors right now, especially with young people. And there's also a genetic factor, which I'll talk about. So the next thing in terms of my protocol of how to control excess glucose is exercise. I didn't realize how effective it is until I did some as I said, this is study. I'm studying myself, how my body works, and everyone has a slight difference. So in my studying of myself with the data I'm collecting, I found out that exercise at the right time is extremely effective. When before I would not even touch pasta because it was a carbohydrate, I've learned now, even at this late stage of 16 years of working with this disease, I can eat pasta and rice, a small amount, maybe a couple of ounces, and then what I do is an hour after I start eating that food, I start exercising maybe, excuse me, from anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes on a elliptical machine. Knocks down the glucose level. The glucose that's in my system is now driven to supply energy to my muscles. It's a very effective way of reducing glucose in your system. Then it continues to rise, and about 2 hours after that, within that time period, the last hour and a half, I do some more, and I do some testing. So I'm on the machine, I'm off the machine, and depending on what I get for a reading, I stop. And usually I can bring it down very effectively, especially in the afternoon. It is not as effective in the evening. So that's another tool. So you have diet, you have drugs, and you have exercise. Now the testing method, here's a simple test kit I use. It tells you exactly the level of glucose in your blood. And if you're interested in calling, you have any questions, feel free. It's 781-944-8888. Testing methods. You got a glucose meter. It's a gold standard. It's a great way after you had your meal, 2 hours after you have your meal, standardized time, you find out what your glucose reading is. If it's too high, you take the action. At this point in time, you only have exercise, but if you've eaten a meal, if you do take drugs, then you take a drug. But if you've eaten too many carbohydrates, and that's what it is, carbohydrates, again and again, you can eat everything else. It's just a matter of the amount of carbohydrates. In terms of food, I can eat everything. It's just the amount. And carbohydrates is where the amount is, specifically. So the meter is very effective, and if you have a reading of 120 or less, it's excellent, and you do not have to do anything at that point. The second reading, which is even far more important, is a reading that you go to a doctor's office or a hospital to get, and it's called the HbA1c, sometimes abbreviated as A1c number. The A1c number determines what you call the percent of glycosylated hemoglobin. It's a kind of complicated word. You don't need to know anything about it. It just tells you the number of blood cells that have glucose basically attached to it. So if they take a reading and you have a reading of, say, 5% to 6% of your blood has some glucose on it, you're in excellent control. Everyone has glucose in their blood system. It's the only way you can get the cells to activate and live your life. If you have a reading of 6 to 7%, that's good control. 7 to 8 is fair. 8 to 9 is poor. The higher you are in that percentage, the more the actual glucose attacks your body from a variety of directions, including arteries, etc. I have been in the excellent range 80–90% of the time since I've been involved with diabetes. Again, I'd like to stay alive for my grandchildren, and anyone who likes to come in here, hopefully within my lifetime this will happen. So the great majority of those who have diabetes do not know how well they've done. And this is the only two tests. Now, if you're a member of a family that has this kind of a problem with glucose, and they tell you, well, the reading's this, oh, it's great. Well, you don't know what conditions they took it. You need to know the HbA1c number. Very few people even know anything about it, never mind acting on it. And some people don't want to know about it because they want to continue reading what they want. They'll give you a reading from here, which is good, but it's only a point in time, and it's not, tells you over a period of time really how bad you are. The glucose reading is the one in which you get a reading, and that reading is over the past 3 months in terms of how effective you have been in controlling the glucose. That is the most important test, and it should be taken, and somebody who is in that family should find out what that number is. If the doctor's not doing that number, you get it from him or you go to another doctor. If the doctor hasn't been doing it, I'd be very suspicious of him as my primary care physician. Well, right now, coming to the end of the show, I got about 5 minutes. And the Straight Talk Health Plan is something that could be utilized to reduce costs of health care. Between 50 and 70% of all our health care costs are associated with people making wrong decisions about their life. Now, if we're going to have socialized medicine, essentially that's what we have. The people who are responsible are paying for those who are irresponsible. Here's a case in point where we could save quite a significant amount of money. Using that HbA1c criteria, which is the gold standard, if someone is out of that range, then they should be assessed a higher cost. That is, if they're up to a poor level, we know what's associated with that condition. And so that person should be paying more to help to change his behavior. This is called an incentive plan. We do not have that at all. And what's happening, and will continue to happen, is those who are irresponsible will be paid by those who are responsible. So I strongly advocate that, and this is, to me, a good way of doing things to reduce costs in healthcare. An analogy: if everyone in your company, if you have a company, came to work and did what they wanted, what kind of profitability would you have? Most likely not anywhere near as much as if everyone had a particular responsibility. So we cannot continue with everyone doing what they want to do. Well, I hope the program has been helpful to you. The next program we'll have will be one discussing the aftermath of the military program, which was one that discussed women in submarines and also Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We had a fine call from Mrs. X. She did not participate, but I will take some clips from our discussion. So, because it's worth it. She came up with some good issues, but also she made some accusations which were incorrect. But it's very important that we have a discussion. And this is what this is all about. You know, it's interesting. The paper I use is Eagle Tribune. Great paper. There are 3 to 4 articles from readers every day. It's a paper in the Merrimack Valley area. Granted, there's many towns, but yet when you look at our papers, the last letter that I've seen about, well, actually there are letters periodically, but they're all, you know, softball kinds of questions, or at least issues they're talking about. The old interest in engaging one another is very important in a democracy. You can't have people with just in silence. The best way of getting the kind of government we want is when you have vigorous discussions. Right now we have more going on in the state legislature. Now we have 31 legislators and who are Republican. Before we only had 10%. So again, I welcome anyone to give me a call. My cell phone is 781-389-6879. Looking for a conversation. And the conversation we'll have will be one where we'll discuss the issues before we come on so that there won't be any surprises And I had that once with one woman who I recruited from another town. I have not had one person in writing to come. Now, I've said before, there's a problem, maybe it's a cognitive problem. The conservative view is kind of diminished. Well, it's not me, it's the other side who's diminished when they don't come to the table to discuss things openly and letting the people decide. So I'm signing off and look forward to seeing you in about 2 more weeks. And at that time, I hope that you have a fine, actually the Christmas session, we'll have it before that, so we'll have one more day to see this Christmas tree. Where is it? Behind me, I guess. Should have been next to me. I'll go back to my newspaper, see any other articles I can see and read for the next program. Thank you and good evening.